Hey everybody, we're going to get started. I'm Hanieh. I am a lecturer in the history of the Middle East and Africa here at SOAS. I'd like to begin by thanking the co-organisers of this seminar series, my colleague Sarah Al-Kazaz, who just messaged me to say she's on her way, Lisa Tilly, Samia Khatun, who unfortunately is a little bit unwell and isn't able to be with us, and of course Tanvi Kanchan, without whom we couldn't do anything really. Before we launch into the discussion of this wonderful book, I wanted to open up with some housekeeping. So I'll tell you a little bit about the way we organize this seminar. Some of you will be familiar with it, but for those of you who are joining us for the first time, so we usually open up with a relatively short presentation from the speaker, so 20-25 minutes, followed by commentary from our three commentators. But afterwards, we'd like to get not just questions, but comments, reflections, and hopefully a discussion going amongst the audience before we hand it back to our speaker, to Mattin. So we usually get sort of 10-15 minutes of that before we ask Mattin to comment, maybe not on every single question, but some of the most important ones. And if we're lucky, we'll have 2 to 3 rounds of that. Because it's Ramadan, we might take a quick 2 to 3 minute break at around the time of iftar in case anybody wants to break a fast. If not, maybe you can just say hello to the person next to you, have a quick chat, and then we're going to resume. So to get started, sadly, we've opened up these seminars in the past by acknowledging the genocide in Gaza, the ongoing Gulf and Western-backed war in Sudan, and now, I'm sad to say, we also confront the Zionist imperialist onslaught on Iran, in which the UK, of course, is complicit, and which we wholeheartedly condemn, even as it emerges in the wake of several dark weeks. I think some of you will agree with me that this book launch is timely in certain respects, for the way Mattin's book foregrounds the question of epistemic coloniality, telling a story of Iran at the intersection of brute imperialism and the persistent coloniality and violence of its nation-state projects, with a rich and sensitive attention to the position of subaltern and working-class organization and resistance. Before I introduce Mattin more formally, it would be remiss not to mention that Mattin was a co-founder of this seminar series, Histories of Capitalism and Race, a project that launched when we co-organized a cross-departmental sort of SOAS-wide workshop by the same name in 2022. So it's really thanks to the time and effort that he put into this seminar series in those early days that this space is still going today. So welcome back, Mattin. And now for the more sort of formal introduction of Mattin and our guests who are going to be responding to his book. Mattin Biglari is a lecturer in Asian and Middle Eastern environmental history at the University of Bristol. His research focuses on the intersection of energy, environment, infrastructure, and labor, especially the history of Iran and the Middle East. His monograph, which we've had the pleasure of reading today, was published with Edinburgh University Press and is entitled Nationalising Oil and Knowledge in Iran, Labor, Decolonisation, and Colonial Modernity. He's also a member of the Oil Cultures of the Middle East and Latin America Research Group, and as we've mentioned, a founding member of the SOAS Walter Rodney Collective. And so now I'd like to introduce our three commentators, beginning with Katayoun. Katayoun Shafiee is an associate professor of the history of the Middle East at the University of Warwick. She is the author of Machineries of Oil, an Infrastructural History of BP in Iran, which, if I may say so, was in many ways pioneering in bringing together histories of the Middle East with the interdisciplinary thinking of the field of SDS. And I also want to mention is a staple of my Middle East history syllabus. She's published many articles on the politics of petroleum formulas, the racial technical regime of oil labor, the transformative role of Anglo-Iranian oil in international law, and the role of neoclassical economics and the politics of water resource development in Iran. And her forthcoming book, if I may mention, which we're very excited about, is entitled Democracy, Governing the Future Along an Iranian River. Next, I'd like to introduce Asma Abdi, who is an ESRC postdoctoral fellow at the University of Exeter and an incoming lecturer in global political economy at the University of Manchester. Her research and teaching sit at the intersection of global political economy, feminist theory, and decolonial post-colonial approaches. In particular, her work has examined questions of social reproduction, everyday survival, empire, and the political economy of war and sanctions, with a regional focus on the Middle East and Iran. Asma's work has received several awards, pretty amazing, including the 2025 Political Studies Association Elizabeth Wiskerman Prize for the Best PhD Dissertation in the Study of Inequality and Social Justice, and the 2025 Lee Douglas Memorial Prize for the Best PhD Dissertation on a Middle Eastern topic. And finally, Adam Hanieh really needs no introduction at SOAS. After a short break and undoubtedly much respite from this institution, we're thrilled that he has made the decision to return to us here as the director of the SOAS Middle East Institute, the MBI Jaber Chair in Middle East Studies, and Professor in Political Economy and Global Development. He has published many books and articles. His most recent book, which we read and discussed here at the Histories of Capitalism and Race seminar last year, is called Crude Capitalism, Oil, Corporate Power, and the Making of the World Market. And it was the co-winner of the 2025 First Book by an International Scholar Award, awarded by the Global and Transnational section of the American Sociological Association. So I'll take a deep breath on all those introductions. Without further ado, we will hand it over to Mattin Biglari to get us started with our discussion by introducing his book.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Hanieh, and thank you so much to Sarah, to Lisa, Hanieh, and also to Tanvi. It really means a lot to me to it's the first book event that I've done, and it means a lot to me to do it here because this was my intellectual home for 10 years. It still is my intellectual home in many ways, and also having been involved in the Walter Rodney Centre. And this, that certainly shaped the book in its final framing. And I know also this has been a very difficult time for many of us here as we watch imperialist powers carpet bomb Iran, and it's been obviously an incredibly difficult time in the past 2.5 years. So it's also, it means a lot to be able to present to you people who are like-minded and who have shaped the book in various ways. And I think given the current events, it's important that we do create some space to discuss, think through how maybe some of the themes of the book might help us understand events today as well. So maybe in the discussion, we can do that. In the introduction now, I'm just going to provide an outline of the book for those of you who haven't been able to read the whole book or maybe read just parts of it. Okay, so this book really hinges on the story of oil nationalization in Iran in 1951, seeing this as a crucial episode to understand global decolonization more broadly. It helped inaugurate an era when governments across the global south increasingly sought to secure sovereignty over natural resources as a means of economic emancipation from imperialism. So influencing, for example, Nasser's decision to nationalize the Suez Canal and also the formation of OPEC. And in fact, as it was unfolding, the Iranian government received messages of congratulations and solidarity from governments across the global south and workers across the global south. Indeed, even though Iran was not formally colonized, oil nationalization brought an end to nearly 50 years of British domination in the southwest province of Khuzestan in Iran. Since the 1901 Darcy concession granted to William Knox Darcy, control of the country's oil industry had been in foreign hands. And it was here that one of the world's major oil corporations, BP, began life as the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later renamed Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, drilling its first well at Masjid Suleiman in the Zagros foothills before transporting this via pipeline to the new refinery of Abadan on the border with Iraq. Very soon, oil from Iran became crucial for British imperialism, serving as the main source of fuel for the Royal Navy, tying Iran and Khuzestan increasingly into networks of British energy imperialism, colonialism, and racial capitalism. This is Abadan refinery in the early years. By the late 1940s, as Britain's empire in many parts of Asia was disintegrating after the Second World War, the company faced its own anti-colonial movement. A large city had grown around the refinery of Abadan that you see here, perhaps as many as 200,000 people. And Abadan was actually, the refinery was the largest in the world at the time. And it was here that the very first calls for oil nationalization were made, not by elites in Tehran. Workers were centrally involved, but it was also a broad-based coalition extending beyond formal labor activism, comprising actors in schools, bazaars, the streets, and homes, all actors we might consider as subalterns. Living and working under the auspices of the British Oil Company, these were the people most directly affected by oil nationalization. So in part, this book asks what nationalization looked like from their vantage point, offering a bottom-up history of global decolonization and resource nationalism, shifting focus away from elites. And also to disrupt narratives that are solely focused on a national scale. Privileging an abstract notion of national sovereignty can obscure what it looks like on the ground and overlook an important fact in this story. That is, even as oil nationalization expelled the British Oil Company from the country, its leading proponents like Mohammad Mossadegh and the National Front sought to keep the company's foreign engineers and technicians to run the newly nationalized industry, especially in refining. And so this book seeks to explain this paradox, which is, a long-standing question posed in anti-colonial, post-colonial, decolonial scholarship. Why a seemingly anti-colonial movement reproduced aspects of coloniality, in this case, epistemic coloniality. Now, I'm gonna laugh at this slide. So, as the book argues, the answer lies in the oil company's efforts to separate the technology and politics of oil, rendering labor and urban politics as external to the technical sphere, despite these actually inhering in technical operations in practice. And in doing so, I'm drawing on much work in STS, but also the book that got me interested in these questions about the intersection or how politics are embedded in technical infrastructures was Carbon Democracy, and also Katayoun's book to bring this STS approach and how politics and technology are separated. But I'm also drawing even more from another of Timothy Mitchell's books, Rule of Experts, in seeing that this process is really underpinned by what he calls technopolitics, a mode of politics that work to simplify the world into an ontologically bifurcated one, opposing on the one hand a realm of human reason, agency, and dynamism to an inert, material, and objective reality on the other hand. And this presents expertise as a preformed set of abstract knowledge, arriving to master the local and the particular. Now, these boundaries are unstable on the ground. Hopefully you see that in some of the chapters, and they constantly need to be reiterated. But nevertheless, this boundary making does political work. This effect does political work. And it certainly shaped the mainstream political discourse around oil nationalization, seeing oil expertise as universal principles true in every country, to quote Tim Mitchell, regardless of local agencies, human or non-human. And so it helped center demands on gaining access to the technical sphere, but not changing its contents, and therefore marginalizing oil workers as non-technical actors. So this book charts how this process happens and how also expertise is being challenged on the ground in 3 key sites: the refinery, the city of Abadan, and the company's training centers. So I'm just going to walk you through the chapters now to outline how. So in chapter 1, this chapter charts the construction of the Abadan refinery from 1912 to the 1940s. It focuses on how the company attempted to construct and transform the refinery in line with a transnational technological zone of standardized technical practices delineated from local society and politics and applicable regardless of local agencies. So here I'm drawing on the work of Andrew Barry and also Katayoun's book. And this linked Abadan to Britain, India, the United States, and global oil cartels through which a mobile set of knowledge formed the basis of claims to expertise rather than situated knowledge on the ground. Through processes such as cracking and the adoption of American refining technologies, the company sought to transform the local material properties of Iranian oil into globally marketable products, presenting this as the triumph of universal reason or science over nature. Yet this process also relied on securitization of the oil fields and dispossession of local communities. For example, local Arab communities already living in Abadan engaged in date cultivation, or pastoral nomads in other areas of Khuzestan who use these lands for grazing, presenting these as terra nullius, or empty land. And here, this is building on Katayoun and the work of people like Kaveh Ehsani. Yet despite its confidence in conquering nature, in enabling the seamless flow of oil from the well to the consumer, another aspect of operations needed to be controlled to avoid friction: labor, the human factor. Based on racialized ideas about productive labor, the company instituted a tripartite hierarchy of labor, placing British staff at the top as the experts, South Asian workers as skilled workers, and then Iranian workers as unskilled. And these stereotypes were inherited from British colonial discourse that the company's managers were immersed in. Many of them had been involved in the British Empire, especially in India. Later, especially in the 1940s, Arab contract workers formed the bottom of this ladder and were denied access to company services and provisions. Yet in the 1920s, the company was faced with a series of labor mobilizations continuing to present friction to the flow of oil and capital, and so turned to increasingly disciplinary practices aimed at turning pastoral nomads into sedentary workers to increase productivity. So it turned to the time and motion studies of scientific management, of Taylorism, attempting to rationalize and control the worker's body as it had standardized and controlled oil, or claimed to at least. And these were also premised on racially coding Iranian workers as lazy. So moving into chapter 2, this follows how these efforts at social engineering extended into the surrounding city of Abadan, because this is where labor, after all, lived and was reproduced. And it was here that the company sought to discipline this human factor beyond the workplace, drawing heavily from wider practices in corporate capitalism, especially Fordism. So socially engineering through urban space, the use of segregation, provision of welfare, sports facilities, etc. And in this chapter, I really draw on, there's a rich social history of oil in Abadan and Khuzestan. People like Kaveh Asani, Touraj Atabaki, Stephanie Cronin, who's here today, and Rasmus Elling. Now, these welfare and infrastructural measures were not benevolent, but aimed at establishing boundaries between the technical and political spheres, stabilizing, reiterating those boundaries I spoke about earlier, and limiting the capacity for disorderly labor to disrupt the technical sphere. Despite starting out as a company town, Abadan exceeded company control as mass migration transformed the city in the interwar period. Informal settlements like Kagaz Abad, which translates as paper town, pollution, overcrowding, and infrastructural inequalities between these areas and the areas inhabited by British staff that you see on the left. All of these showed the unwillingness of the company to fully take accountability for the social reproduction of its workforce, and so instead choosing to outsource this. And it's here that I engage with social reproduction theory to also examine how, despite oil operations being presented as a masculine domain, the company relied on the labor of women, both waged and unwaged. And, you know, in work like, for example, nurses in teaching in kindergartens. And by the mid-1940s, when there was an Allied occupation of Iran, Abadan especially suffered extremely worsening living conditions, inflation, housing shortages, food shortages, all of which were, you know, food was being requisitioned by the British at the time, and not to mention continued infrastructural violence. All of this was creating a context of in which an anti-colonial movement would emerge, led by the Communist Tudeh Party at this time, who led the strike in 1946. And this was really an urban coalition that extended beyond just formal oil workers. So we see here how the sphere of social reproduction became central to anti-colonial mobilization, and also demonstrated that the oil company was still beholden to the political sphere, despite trying to disentangle itself as a purely technical operation. So chapter 3 moves on to the company's training schemes and their relationship to social engineering and divisions of knowledge that were being instituted. In response to labor unrest and sort of the Iranian government's pressures to Iranianize the workforce, i.e. promote Iranians to higher positions in the company and replace British and South Asian employees, the company built several training schemes. So, for example, builds this Abadan Technical Institute in 1939. The company also sent some students to train in Britain as well. Now, while these initiatives appeared to open pathways for Iranians into technical roles, they reinforced this division between mental and manual labor. So artisan apprentices were trained through repetitive rote learning in workshops, whereas a small group of students gained access to what was then defined as specialized oil knowledge through courses in petroleum technology. And this reinforced abstract scientific knowledge as the benchmark, the true benchmark of oil expertise, and making access to this increasingly contentious. Beyond the classroom, the company cultivated character training through hostels, which they heavily surveyed, hygiene regimes, a sports culture inherited from drawing on the British Empire and colonial boarding schools. And these were all aimed to cultivate a self-reliant, loyal, disciplined student body obedient to management. But these efforts generated tensions, and students increasingly criticized the barriers to promotion. And in a way, these spaces created by the company were used against the company. They created anti-colonial subjectivities. So chapter 4, which I think you got an extract of, moves back to Abadan, to the refinery in the late 1940s, looking at everyday politics in contestations over expertise. So it argues that after the 1946 strike, the company sought to mitigate this rising opposition through public relations, demonstrating the indispensability of its expertise for the nation's wealth. And the Abadan refinery figured prominently in these efforts, which was increasingly represented visually as a technological zone, detached from local factors and agencies, almost literally a black box where workers are made invisible, this sort of automated system. Yet the everyday life of the refinery contradicted or destabilized such images. So frequent fires, toxic exposure, industrial accidents revealed the material fragility of refinery operations. And through safety disputes and consultations with management, workers were able to intervene and contest management's claim to monopolize expertise. So, for example, in debates in 1950 over sulfur dioxide exposure, workers mobilized their embodied knowledge and sensory experience and even petitioned the Iranian parliament in petitions like this, contesting the management's claim to monopolize expertise, detecting, for example, toxic gases through their sensory experience, and thereby blurring mind-body dualisms and foregrounding embodied knowledge as a legitimate basis of expertise. How are we doing for time?
I'm
sorry.
Maybe another 5 minutes?
Yeah, okay. So chapter 5 shows how these messy realities on the ground in the Abadan refinery, messy realities of technopolitics, were translated into the mainstream political discourse that was shaping the oil nationalization movement in Tehran. So I follow how journalists started to visit Abadan and started reporting on conditions in the town. And whilst they're fueling nationalist opposition to the company by reporting on social inequalities in the town, they simultaneously expressed awe at the technical installations of the company, reinforcing this belief that oil expertise or the technical sphere was politically neutral, and continuing this separation of technology and politics that the company had started. As debates over creating an Iranian oil company intensified in the late 1940s, discussion increasingly centered not on transforming oil knowledge, but on securing access to it, often through foreign experts, many of whom had never even visited Abadan. Even critics of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company from the National Front, the main coalition fighting for nationalization, they praised the oil company's technical installations, even calling them the most perfect in the world. By early 1951, this logic decisively shaped government policy. So after consulting engineers in Tehran, not in Abadan, not workers in Abadan, Mossadegh and the National Front concluded that Iran lacked sufficient expertise, sufficient experts to run its oil industry, especially in refining. And thus, British or foreign experts needed to be maintained to run the industry. So chapter 6 then looks at what happens after nationalization is implemented, the bill is announced. And what we see here is that after nationalization is announced, oil workers in Abadan and in Khuzestan intervene to put forward their own vision of what nationalization should look like on the ground, challenging these abstract notions of national sovereignty emanating from Tehran. And here I show how, and here we really see how they saw nationalization as an opportunity to redress grievances of everyday life that they'd had over many years. For example, over wages, housing, discrimination, barriers to promotion, all situated within the urban politics and the labor politics of the city. The strike exposed tensions within the nationalization movement. So political leaders and major newspapers circulated a conspiracy theory that this had somehow been started by the British to undermine oil nationalization. And this leads to the government trying to clamp down on the strikes. So we see tanks being deployed, we see students being killed by the police. But we also see tensions in the way different actors are viewed by Tehran. So, for example, students, there seem to be a bit more sympathy towards, based on this idea that they might be future experts. Whereas workers, we see the ongoing kind of marginalization of. So finally, in the epilogue, I examine the aftermath of nationalization, arguing that while formal control over oil shifted to the new National Iranian Oil Company, the deeper epistemic and technical structures of the industry remain largely intact. At the same time, I show, maybe I don't do this enough, I think, how imperialist efforts undermined nationalization in these 2 key years, chiefly through a British-led international boycott of Iranian oil, resulting in equipment shortages, unsafe working conditions, and ongoing labor grievances. And I could not end this without mentioning the most egregious case of imperialist intervention in this story, which is the 1953 coup organized by Britain and the US, toppling Mossadegh and restoring multinational control over Iran's oil. Zooming out, the epilogue also follows how the Abadan crisis shaped the global oil industry towards post-Fordist strategies, new strategies of political disentanglement, subcontracting, disaggregation of refining, automation, more moves towards enclaves, to prevent another Abadan happening. They talk explicitly about this. So maybe that's something we can talk about a bit more in the discussion. But paradoxically, within Iran, oil workers retained centrality in politics because, of course, in the 1979 revolution, it was oil workers' strike, the general strike of oil workers, that helped topple the Shah. So I think I'm out of time, but thank you so much.
Thank you for a fantastic presentation. We're going to turn to Katayoun, I think, the first set of comments.
Yes, congratulations to Mattin on this important contribution to the history of oil and expertise in the Middle East and the politics of anti-colonial nationalism within the wider history of organization that, as you say, centers the role played by oil labor, among many others, subaltern actors in the specific and local history of Southwest Iran in the mid-20th century. So I will just raise some of the most interesting points and interventions that I found worth noting as I went through the chapters and the ones that were circulated. I appreciated how you discuss this history in terms of a political process of entanglement and disentanglement to think about technopolitics from the ground up. You consider what this tells us about questions of subaltern political subjectivity. You call these embodied practices that are irreducible to colonial modernity and is not confined to the oil enclave alone, but forms part of a series of overflows that in turn shape oil nationalization with significant consequences. And so you raise an interesting point in chapter 4 about how the company's technocratic authority cannot control the means of its disentanglement, inadvertently creating conditions for politics to challenge its very existence. Secondly, you offer a rich and varied local history of workers, but especially those people who fall outside the oil-based border regime enforced within company domains, to think about the politics of urban infrastructure and violence. You argue that these questions of tacit knowledge, gendered and racialized socio-technical hierarchy all shape possibilities for local actors to pursue alternative political courses of action that cannot be reduced to questions of resistance. You say it is the workers, the residents, party activists, and government officials who act according to the same technopolitical divides, to place the company management in the political domain instead of its preferred technical domain, which is a nice way of putting it, to kind of think about the vulnerabilities that were generated and the real democratic threat that they posed. Thirdly, and sort of pushing against the previous scholarship, you say there's nothing inevitable. About this, you argue in terms of the connection between the company's decades-long presence and the Iranian government's oil nationalization. So I thought that was compelling and provocative. So could you say more about the question of causality, or if that makes sense, or the features of the dynamic that does or does not lead to the moment of oil crisis? Overall, I think the book exposes new company strategies in terms of this idea of black boxing expertise that are pivotal after 1946. So thinking about that technocratic language of incompetence and lack of discipline and inefficiency, repeatedly deployed to conceal the uncertainties generated in moments of breakdown, such as the fires at the refinery. So to say that safety policy was a key site for management's claims to expertise is a useful way to highlight the richer set of disobedient acts that were exhibited by the workers that often gets buried within the technicalities of the archival descriptions, and indeed does expose the business strategy of the company in this peculiar way. I also appreciate, stop me if I go over. I also appreciate how you blur ontological dualisms, which you mentioned in your talk, to question the stakes attached to the managerial expertise. Again, this idea that the technical domain, privileged mind over body, or disembodied knowledge over embodied knowledge. Now, what's most interesting is when tacit knowledge is recast in technical terms as grades of work, for example, to challenge and make demands in and of the company domain. It's corporal knowledge, you say, that stands at odds with the PR and information administration, or that internal information management of the company. I think you also rightly question decision-making and negotiation in technical manners as an instance of world-making around industrial relations, as Iran concedes more power to labor through legislation in terms of the right to develop, but also to combat communism in the broader Cold War context. There's an interesting twist revealed within the knowledge controversies you trace, where the oil company pursues safety around the technical domain, but not the protection of its workers, evidencing the instability of the border regime. And so the overall contribution of all this is this ultimate paradox in the reproduction of what you call the epistemic assumptions of the very oil company Iran expelled, especially the divide, the technopolitical divide, to the exclusion of locals who had always been there as what you said in your talk, political and non-technical actors. So this is a very rich assessment of Iranian periodicals, for example, to convey how these assumptions are maintained or critiqued. It's a very interesting way. There's an interesting way in which local papers manage to do the work of the company's PR efforts, distinguishing between technical and political worlds of oil that are also gendered. Two more points. It is also noteworthy that the circumstances leading to oil nationalization involve a struggle over the features of oil expertise, what constitutes it, who it's deployed by, and for what purposes. I was very curious as to why the Mossadegh's questionnaire wasn't shared with the company engineers, if it's just a simple answer, but I would just like to know. It's, of course, notable to highlight that the workers' own experience and knowledge was excluded here. And it's also extremely refreshing, finally, to see the richness of the historical evidence mobilized to make visible the subaltern or embodied knowledge of local workers, the journalists, the students, and the population at large. That helps us to see that alternative kinds of future were indeed put forward in terms of more radical forms of control. So yeah, thank you for that.
So
Thank you.
And so yeah, thank you so much, and yeah, congratulations, Mattin, on the book. I thought it's very fascinating and timely, and your book makes contributions across like various debates on racialized capitalism, colonialism, Iran, Middle East, but even everything that's happening in Iran, and and also given the fact that my own expertise is on the current and the contemporary, like my work deals with the same type of similar sets of questions of sovereignty of the empire, but within the contemporary moment in the context of the US imposition of sanctions on Iran. So I was like constantly reading your book with this, with thinking about these continuities and discontinuities, right? In terms of how the themes that you talk about, how they can be relevant for the current moment. And I think in many ways it's quite surreal to read your book at the moment, because I was just mentioning that, but I think this history is so much like we don't see it at all, right? I mean, you're talking about all of this anti-colonial labor kind of the struggles over social reproduction, that we see the same type of struggles over social reproduction that sanctions has created in Iran, right? But I guess the moment that you're talking about the empire is so present and visible, right? In your book, you talk about this concept that I love, that like the regimes of imperceptibility. And I thought, like, as a way of the empire being in Iran through sanctions previously, but now also like, through military interventions, it's like, the contrast is that at the time that you're talking about, the empire is visibly there, but all the sanctions, I think, works through invisibility. I mean, that's part of the power of the sanctions, I guess. So with that in mind, I'm going to I first say like something that your book, like that I've really, really found very refreshing about your book and very important, I think, it's in how it disrupts the dominant framings of Iran, which is often, I mean, not only in public debate, but also in a lot of scholarly work is like so much viewed through the kind of, you also mentioned that, I acknowledge that in your introduction, through a statist and nationalist methodologies, right? Everything is all the problem, perhaps also because of these regimes of imperceptibility at them. I mean, the whole thing about sanctions is that it's isolated from the globe, right? So the global is often very much missed from how Iran is understood. Iran is not usually written into these global structures of capitalism. And that was something that I found your book is very important, but also, it's not only the global as the scale, but also the everyday. I think it's also you center this agency of the everyday, which is also very important. I mean, right now, I mean, if the everyday was very visible in Iran, maybe like the whole war machinery pushing for Iran relies upon this like kind of a statist and nationalist kind of frameworks, right? To frame all the problems in Iran in relation just to the Iranian state, right? And in relation to the local kind of structures, very detached from this, both the question of the global, but also especially also capitalism, right? So that's very important. I think it's very important about your book, and timely. And the other kind of question, I mean, I want to ask this as a question. What I found really also so fascinating about how you conceptualize sovereignty in relation to knowledge and expertise, right? So you have this really, this like very powerful concept of technopolitics as a way of as a colonial worldview of like separating the politics from the technology, and you also argue that how for the Anglo-American oil company, like constructing knowledge as indispensable from the company was so central for extraction of labor and extraction of resources, right? It was like the whole like that dualism, that like that ontological and epistemological dualism was very central. And then you also talk about how, like many other decolonial moments, like decolonization, like, well, I mean, if you're gonna, you frame it, I guess, right? Or in nationalism decolonial also moment, right? But that coloniality outlived, right? So that's why I love the title of your book, Nationalising Oil and Knowledge. So oil became nationalized, but not knowledge, right? And I wonder, to some extent, can we see the current moment as a as a struggle over knowledge, and in terms of Iran's sovereignty, in terms of I mean, that's also a question just put out there, is that how like the whole nuclear program, the whole like missile programs and all of that, is part of that has always been about that Iran shouldn't have that knowledge, right? And that's why, for example, we've seen, I mean, regardless of if we agree with that or not, right? But part of all of these tensions is around expertise and knowledge. And I found it like really actually interesting, because I was reading your book and I saw this interview with Arakchi, who was the negotiator from the Iranian side with these negotiations with the US. And when he was interviewed in one of these like channels, I don't know, I can't remember exactly, but the interviewer asked him, why do you push for this nuclear enrichment? This is gonna bring you war and all of that. And he responded that, well, this is a knowledge that we have developed ourselves. This is very dear to us, right? And I found it actually, because I was reading your book, I found it really interesting to think about. I've never thought about, like, but also the whole sanction regimes. A very important part of it was like the sanctioning of the universities. Right now we see the bombing of universities. I mean, the whole, but also like in Palestine, in Gaza. I mean, this is part of like the fact about the struggle over knowledge. I mean, to some extent, we can understand maybe these questions of sovereignty, like nationalism, these nationalist struggles, the war at the moment through this kind of lens. And do I have time for a last point?
I'm not a very good capitalist timekeeper. 2 more minutes.
Okay. So the last thing is, like, also I found your discussion of gender and social reproduction I think very important, because oftentimes, I mean, it's missed from the accounts of racialized capitalism, but also gender in Iran in particular is always like framed very detached from this material kind of dimensions that shapes gender. And I didn't get to read your chapter on gender in depth, but the example that you have in your introduction, I found it really fascinating. It's very similar actually to current moment. You were saying that the company promoted marriage as a way of offloading social reproduction and in my own work, I've argued that we, like the last decade of, like, as a response to this widespread crisis of social reproduction, what we see also is the promotion of, like, what in the Iranian kind of discourse they refer to that as early marriage. The whole, there's lots of policies and stuff around that. As a way of so that's also, like, I mean, I didn't get to read that chapter, so it would be also nice if you can, because I think here is also something is important about this. You're also talking about how here gender is doing the work of the race, right? How gender, I mean, kind of a patriarchal, like the company draws on these patriarchal frameworks, right, and consolidate them to extract labor, to facilitate the labor extractions and resource extraction and all of that. So you're also putting gender within, writing gender into this wider history, of which I found it very interesting. And I would love to read that chapter more in depth.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Asma.
Okay. Thank you. I just want to begin echoing the other comments around how wonderful this book is. And I got sent the whole book, so I managed to read more than those chapters. And I think it's really a very, very important contribution, not just to kind of Middle East kind of debates, but also thinking about oil, fossil fuels in the global context, as well as the issues, around labor and so forth. So I want to touch on a few of these things in my questions. And just to praise the book a little bit more, I really think one of the most important contributions here is that Mattin is looking at the downstream of the oil sector, not simply the upstream or the underground reserves of crude oil, but thinking about what oil becomes as it gets refined, obviously in this instance, and gets transport. I mean, transport infrastructures play a big role in the book as well. And thinking about how those kind of downstream parts of the value chain are as important, if not more important, actually, than the underground crude reserves. And again, in terms of thinking about the current moment, I think a lot of the kind of analysis, not just about what's happening in Iran at the moment, but also what happened in Venezuela a few weeks ago, got the picture totally wrong because they didn't think about refining, for example, and transport and these kind of logistical infrastructures. So that to me is I think like it really does it really illustrates why it's so important to look at the downstream and not just the upstream. The other thing I really loved the chapter on the city, and it reminded me of some of the writing about Baku.
Oh yeah,
as like the archetypal one of the first kind of oil towns and the politics there. But you know, I think you do it much better than most of the writing that is on Baku in that sense. So and yeah, as Asma said, around thinking about gender relations in the city and the politics of this. So I had 4 questions I want, or yeah, things I'd like to hear more about. One is you make an interesting point at the beginning, in the beginning chapter, I think, and you make this all the way through, that the strikes in Abadan, the movements have a really big impact on the rest of the region, in particular Egypt. And the formation of you know, the 1952 revolution in Egypt. You connect it to 1951. Others have done this as well. And I'm wondering if you could, because one of the things that happens after this, after you know your book ends and after 52, etc., is that a lot of the discussion about oil and the nationalization of oil in the region becomes quite you know, ethnicized. You know, you hear slogans like Arab oil for the Arab masses. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about how things change in the ways that this moment of nationalization actually feeds into a different kind of nationalism as well, that is not necessarily about nationalism or not necessarily about sovereignty, or it is about sovereignty, but it's not about, it becomes about Arab nationalism, for example, in the rest of the region. And that can be actually quite exclusive and marginalizing of other Kurdish and non-Arab minorities in the region. And in the Iranian context, it becomes about Iranian nationalism. So anyway, some kind of reflection on how the kind of different nationalisms might emerge, or more ethnicized nationalisms might emerge post 51. And then the second question I had, again, on this question of the oil value chain, and thinking about the whole of the downstream and not just the upstream. And I was thinking, reading this discussion, number one, I'd like to hear a bit more about the actual upstream in Iran, because it seems to me what the story you tell here, it's actually quite different from a lot of other places in the sense, I was thinking about Venezuela. And the early oil industry in Venezuela, where you see a deliberate attempt by the Western multinationals like Shell to construct their refineries outside of Venezuelan territory on the Dutch-controlled Caribbean islands like Curaçao and these. And they did it deliberately, precisely because they wanted to undercut any potential of what happened in Iran of this kind of worker mobilization. So, you know, by locating it on an island outside, or, you know, in separate territories, staffed by migrant workers. And it was explicitly formulated in this way that you break the power of oil workers, or the potential power of oil workers in Venezuela. So yeah, this kind of if you could talk a little bit about how and you can see this other ways as well. You know, in Saudi Arabia, for example, a lot of the oil that's produced is actually refined in the West in this moment, or in the 30s and 40s and 50s. So this separation of the refining industry, like territorially outside of where the crude supplies are located. So how much of the story, I guess, is specific to the fact that the refinery is actually located right next door to where the crude supplies are, in this context. But and then the third thing, and you mentioned this in your presentation also, it comes very much through the book, is this idea of embodied knowledge, as kind of thinking about the knowledge side of the industry. And I wanted to hear more from you about how these different categories of workers that you spoke about, the contract Arab workers, for instance, or the Iranian workers, or the different kind of hierarchical structure of the labor force, plays into different kinds of knowledge, if you like, embodied knowledge, and are there tensions in that, in what knowledge different groups of workers might possess, if you like. And then the final question, which I found really interesting, I think I can't remember which chapter it is, but it's towards the end of the book. You mention somewhere about, it's on page 225, I think. You talk about how the Tudeh party actually opposed nationalization, and you say for fears that it would empower the US and end the chances of a Soviet oil concession in the north. And I found that I didn't know that, actually, and I think it's really interesting to see how the Tudeh party, which you kind of talk about in the earlier chapters as being a key force in the workers' movement in Abadan, actually ends up opposing nationalization. And if you could talk more about the kind of tensions between this pro-Soviet party and kind of the labor movement or workers' movement, or the wider politics around the refinery. How did that manifest? Did they consistently oppose nationalization all the way through? And if so, I mean, surely that must also have created tensions with the workers who were advocating for this. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam.
Do you want to?
Yeah. And thank you so much for your generosity in all your comments and taking the time and effort to engage with the book so fully. So really appreciate it, especially in these times. Where do I start? Maybe I could just start with what's freshest in my mind is this issue of the Tudeh party. So the Tudeh party, when they emerge on the scene in sort of during the World War II in Abadan, is sort of very fluid membership. It's not really centralized or dictated to by Moscow. So there's a very sort of grassroots aspect to the Tudeh at this particular moment. And in the 1946 general strike, it's Tudeh activists who are part of these calls for oil nationalization. And that kind of shifts in the late 40s because then what starts happening is discussions emerge about maybe we can exploit oil in the north of Iran, and the idea that this might be something that the Soviet Union could access. So, and there are developments, there's a split in the Tudeh party as well in the late 40s, and many people who are kind of opposed to the top-down directives of Moscow leave the party at this time. And by the time of oil nationalization, in terms of the vacuum left by the Tudeh party in opposing oil nationalization, that's when the National Front gains popularity because they're the only ones now kind of calling for oil nationalisation. But having said that, the Tudeh party does come back to Abadan and plays an important role later. So it's not completely alienated from the movement. In terms of this issue of the downstream, I completely agree with you. And anybody who knows me knows that I'm obsessed with oil refineries for some reason, which I never thought I would be. But I think oil refineries and petrochemical complexes are absolutely crucial in, I think I talked about this in chapter 1, converting the sort of local material properties of oil, no matter where it is, into these kind of abstract, global, marketable products, but also because they are centers of the highest concentration of labor in the oil industry. And in doing so, they also got to think about refineries as needing ongoing maintenance. The materiality of refineries requires that they have a durability there, which requires maintenance and requires a lot of manual labor to maintain. And so there's obviously opportunities for sabotage, opportunities for mobilizations. They create spaces of for collective solidarities to emerge. What was the other thing I was going to say about refineries? Yeah, so I suppose this is where a lot of people have said the oil industry has this kind of automated, self-regulating system, and refineries played a key role in that, in automation and sort of trends in broader capitalism. It was computerization in refineries, especially in the US in the 50s, that really kind of ushered in automation, accelerated those trends. But what I see here is that was an ideal that didn't reflect reality in Abadan. It was an ideal before it could be put into practice. And so, yeah, I think I was going to say that's also why there's new efforts to disaggregate refining after oil nationalization in Iran to stop one single refinery being a bottleneck. And BP, it starts to, not just BP, many oil corporations, they move refining operations away from centers of oil production or exploitation towards markets. So the 50s and 60s, we see refineries being built all across Europe so that not one single refinery could be this bottleneck. And finally, another reason why downstream sector is so important is because it really turns our attention to countries that might not have oil reserves themselves, but have huge oil industries. So we're talking about, for example, China, India have some of the largest oil industries in the world, mainly through the downstream sector. We don't tend to think of them as oil countries. And that work of invisibility does work here in the kind of politics that follows from that. Venezuela, I wish I had read your book before I wrote this, because so this was earlier, the separation between the refinery and wow, see that? So maybe I overstated the significance of this shift here, but yeah, that's fascinating. In terms of embodied knowledge, so this is key because a lot of the embodied knowledge that oil workers in the refinery are drawing on is actually from the very safety training and artisan apprenticeships that the company is providing. And so there is, to some extent, yeah, it's through the subjectivities produced by the oil company that they're drawing their embodied knowledge. That embodied knowledge is not necessarily like autonomous or, prior to the oil industry. With a lot of Arab contract workers, they were involved in construction work. and were not necessarily given the training. They didn't get access to the training. And unfortunately, the sources, the voices of those workers doesn't come through. So I wish I could tell you how they saw embodied knowledge, but the only access to those that I got was from those who actually had been through the training schemes, and redefining the technical by talking about manual dexterity. Okay. Asma, thank you so much. I hadn't even considered this aspect of sovereignty over knowledge in terms of the nuclear program. But now you said it, just makes so much sense in terms of the politicization of knowledge and expertise, and trying to deny that to Iran. I really think that helps us explain a lot about what's going on with the nuclear program. The social reproduction. So often, and this relates to labor more generally, in the sense that writing labor in the oil industry it's not something that's been done until relatively recently. And so social reproduction as well has been made doubly invisible. And with social reproduction, I wanted to be careful in not treating it as purely just for the purposes of the company and kind of profit making and reproducing the workers, but also exceeding capitalist relations as well, in terms of social reproduction as care and kind of reproduction of life beyond just that which reproduces capitalism. So I don't know if I did that successfully enough, but I think that's a careful line you need to be wary of. So yeah, if those of you who did read that part, maybe I'd appreciate your feedback. And yes, and thank you, Katayoun. The question about Mossadegh's questionnaire. Now you say that, I need to revisit that source to see when it was. But actually, what's interesting is that they're consulting these foreign experts, not those of the oil company, but then in kind of choosing to keep on the British experts rather than bringing the foreign experts in. I think it reinforces this view of expertise as just this kind of universal technical domain that, regardless of nationality or whatever political bias you might have, that those principles are still the same. And I think maybe in the questionnaire they're not consulting the British engineers because these are like potentially internal discussions before nationalization is implemented. So they don't want to give up information in that sense. But I need to double check the timing of that source. Yes. And then how are we doing for time? Should I?
Maybe just another minute and then open it up.
I think the question of causality, in terms of the inevitability of.
I guess so. I mean, I don't know. I was just thinking.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if that's just you intervening, because I understand the whole nationalist historiography and kind of you talk about like constitutional revolution.
Yes, yeah.
Part of it, but then I thought maybe are you saying something beyond that?
Yeah, I suppose it's part of this effort to situate Iran at this time within a global story, and through Abadan and Khuzestan's entanglement in British imperial networks. For example, there's a story of partition, there's a story of the Nakba, also in playing out in Abadan as well. And also trying to talk about the contingencies of World War II. So rather than seeing this teleological version of events, which sees oil nationalization as just inevitable, in order to understand the timing of it, at least, that it's very much dependent on these contingencies, both globally and locally as well. Yeah,
Okay, thanks so yeah.
Thank
Are
you.
you done?
Yes.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mattin. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No.
We're going to carry on. Let's open it up to the audience for comments, questions, thoughts. Who would like to get us started? Yes.
Many have already raised this issue about ethnic groups in the province. I understand that there are different ethnic groups there, but how the oil company made use of the division between all these ethnic groups to their advantage, and whether the political leadership in Tehran was in a subtle agreement or disagreement of what the policy was of the oil company, and whether this led to the success of the nationalization process or not.
Aisha.
I don't think I'm perfectly formulated this question, but this I think builds on Asma's point about knowledge production and sovereignty, and specifically knowledge production that we're doing in academia today. I was just wondering, like under globalization, we are facing all of these different systemic crises which we try to resolve by coming up with different iterations of the like definitions of sovereignty. If there's food sovereignty, there's resource sovereignty, there is educational sovereignty, knowledge sovereignty. There are so many different kinds of sovereignties that we come up with because national sovereignty has been completely like emptied off of its sort of contents under globalization. I was just thinking whether or not like the implications of your kind of work, implications of decolonizing knowledge today, of like specifically technocratic knowledge today, like is there a way of turning that into like is there a way of investing that knowledge in a revolutionary subject that is not the nation? So that is like a more international subject, like workers' subjectivity or like workers' expertise and workers' knowledge. Like it's a way of decolonizing knowledge that does not revert back to like national educational institutions, so to speak, or national technocratic institutions placed in Iran, but also not only in Iran, but operating under the sort of energy imperialism that we are experiencing at like steroids today.
As people think of their questions, I'll jump in the spirit of discussion, just on drawing the connection to the contemporary situation and the idea of nuclear expertise and knowledge. If we're to take, I think, Mattin's approach sort of very seriously, then even Araghchi, he would be in the position of the National Front or Mossadegh, for instance, although that's very sort of complementary. But as in, though he would be in the position of the elites who claim a certain kind of expertise to the exclusion of the kinds of subaltern, I think, embodied, sort of marginalized knowledge that I think your text sort of brings out. But it's tough because it's hard not to, again, just fall back into that sort of binaristic framing of the brutality of empire and then the kind of indigenized sort of knowledge of the nation states. And the thing that was really sort of kind of pertinent in reading Mattin's book at this particular moment for me was the continuity precisely in that nation state form and its modalities of knowledge, its technocracy that doesn't change whether, I mean, hopefully it could change, but tends not to change whether you have the National Front, whether you have, let's say, the Islamic Republic, whether you have imperialist powers. There's a degree of continuity epistemically that I think your book, I mean, it does many, many things, but that's sort of one of its sort of provocations. It's quite controversial in that sense, right? Because you're turning around and you're speaking back to this legacy of sort of lionizing Mossadegh and, you know, the national front, right? So they don't look very good in this.
No.
The oil workers at the end of the day are treated pretty badly in those early years before the coup. And of course, the Shah looks terrible in this. I mean, we didn't really talk about that, but, you know, in this political moment, they themselves just end up being imperialist puppets in this moment, and again reproduce that form of sort of epistemic oppression. I abused my position as chair. It's always a risk when I'm here. Henry.
Thanks so much for this, Mattin, and yeah, congrats on an amazing project and now book. I was really interested in your I guess qualification that this embodied knowledge that you're talking about in the book shouldn't be conceived as something that pre-existed the sort of processes of kind of techno-political disentanglement that emerged at, you know, in sort of various venues, including the oil refinery. Because I guess thinking about the sort of Mitchellian tradition more broadly, this is often sort of a critique that is leveled against his work. Sort of, he, you know, talks about the rise of these binaries in modernity between subject and object, you know, representation and reality, politics and science and so forth, which are then sort of, you know, imposed in colonial contexts on regions that used to be sort of, you know, organized otherwise. Right. And so, and often he has been criticized for imputing a kind of fullness or sort of coherence or to, for instance, pre-19th century Egypt. That pre-19th century Egypt was sort of, you know, a region in which that was not divided, that was whole, that in which there was no sort of distinction between reality and representation. And so sometimes he's been sort of criticized for this. And so what I thought was really interesting was, you know, at first glance, you might think of, you know, this idea of embodied knowledge as being that which pre-existed the process, right? But what I hear in, I guess, that qualification is you sort of offering a kind of rejoinder, that what you're trying to argue is not that what was, you know, torn apart, that it wasn't as though there was some sort of previously existing kind of wholeness or knowledge or, you know, indigenous knowledge or what have you that was, you know, disentangled into sort of, you know, politics and science, technology and labor, what have you, but rather that sort of embodiment was itself produced at the site of the oil refinery. So I thought that was really interesting, and I guess I'd like to hear you just reflect further on that question and what exactly the claim is, how we should be thinking about this embodied knowledge. You know, what is it? Where does it come from? What is its relation to the sort of modernist processes of disentanglement that you trace in this book?
Yes.
I have a hopefully easy question, but I'm just curious. I haven't read your book yet. I'm curious what happened to this tripartite labor structure, and particularly the South Asian workers in the sort of middle tier skilled level. Like, how did they fit in politically, and did they remain past nationalization? And if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Sarah?
Again, congrats, Mattin. It's just amazing to see the book come out and to get a chance to kind of launch it through the series. So congratulations. And thank you for giving us such a rich work to think with. I'm still in the depths of reading, so I'm not completely done. And so if my question is already like somewhere in the book, apologies for that. But this is a self-serving question because I've been thinking about the vulnerabilities of corporate power quite a bit. And I guess I wanted to kind of have a conversation a little bit more about that. And a lot of the literature that I think with is talking about the oil corporation. And so it was really helpful to be reading your book as I'm trying to figure this out. But one of the really striking things about what I get out of your book is thinking about the vulnerability of corporations to this embodied knowledge or their epistemic vulnerabilities, right? In the sense that a lot of the time when we talk about vulnerability, we're talking about sabotage, organizing, etc. And it's, sometimes it's about kind of the material infrastructure itself, how it's organized, the spatial, and so on. And I think I kind of see you kind of pushing us to really think about the role of knowledge in producing those vulnerabilities. I'm curious if you like to hear you talk a little bit more about the relationship between kind of knowledge and organization in that sense, if we are to think like the ways in which maybe thinking with the epistemic complicates how we think about the vulnerabilities of these corporations. And then also this is a space for you, I think, kind of also where Adam, you've already kind of started this conversation with Adam, but more on this like the remaking of or like moving towards this post-Fordist kind of organization that you talk about in the epilogue as ways to kind of deal with some of those vulnerabilities. I was curious if you could push that a little bit more.
Maybe you should, maybe think about responding to some, if not all of those.
Yeah, amazing questions.
We'll get another round.
Yeah, I must apologize. I'm not the sharpest today with my lack of sleep the last few days, but I'll do my best. This question of, I'll take the question of ethnic divisions and South Asian workers together. What's clear is that the company from the outset was drawing on typical strategies of racial capitalism to pit workers against each other based along racial ethnic lines. This is done through urban segregation as well. So different areas of the city, there's an area mainly for the South Asian workers. There's an area mainly for the Iranian workers. And the spatial politics of the city does produce like tension between these groups as well. In 1942, there's an incident where members of people from the Iranian areas of the city enter into the fenced areas of where the South Asian workers are, and there's violence. So it's clear that there was this attempt, and then also with in terms of some of the Arab tribal confederations in Khuzestan, the company did try to mobilize them against the labor movements. So in the 1946 strike, they actually tried to organize the Arab tribes to try and crush the movements. Now, what I found when I was looking at the strikes is that actually those ethnic divisions didn't map out onto the actual composition of the labor movement, and that there's a lot of transnational solidarity, articulation of class consciousness or solidarity, cutting across ethnic lines. So those efforts did fail to an extent, but the calls to Iranianize the workforce were persistent, and often it was directed against the South Asian workers. And gradually in the sort of 1940s, especially 1930s, 1940s, the number of South Asian workers employed by the company declined and Iranian workers increased. What happens also with the late 1940s is then that Indian workers, with partition and independence of India, they also seek to, they petition the Indian government about injustices they were facing in Abadan, and increasingly kind of see themselves as kind of separate, I guess, by appealing to this idea of national sovereignty in India. So yeah, those divisions are there. So embodied knowledge. This is something I've been struggling with for many years now, because I've been criticized for reproducing a mind-body dualism by positing embodied knowledge. Also, I've been criticised for, which I kind of agree with in part, or seeing embodied knowledge, not seeing pre-existing forms of knowledge, which you're referring to, as part of the story. And I guess for me, I was interested in the kind of, because we have these students who are kind of trained at such an early age in Abadan, where there's this subject formation and these kind of disciplinary mechanisms. It's very difficult to see any prior embodied knowledge to be part of this story, in a sense. Obviously, there are some, but in terms of visibility in the archive, it's very difficult to find as well. Yes. And I need to think more about the how does embodied knowledge, I guess one thing that I think I didn't do enough of in the book is thinking about how embodied knowledge enables knowledge of sabotage. So in these strikes, the refinery is brought to a halt. How does that happen? How do the workers have the knowledge of how to operate these infrastructures? And I think that's something I wish I could do more of, to look at that. Because I also think there's a danger of, this is sort of another self-critique, but a danger of romanticizing these disputes over embodied knowledge meetings, because in terms of leading to the sort of political effect of those, it could also just be co-opted, appropriated by management to kind of maintain the status quo. So yeah, I think that's something we can talk about more about how the relationship between embodied knowledge and actual political action. Then sovereignty over knowledge that doesn't conform to the nation.
Doesn't revert back to the nation as the revolutionary subject.
Yes. Yeah, and I think I guess that's what I'm trying to do, is get past this nationalist focus on the nation states, the national scale, and look at how, especially economic decolonization, focusing on that overlooks marginalization of subaltern actors, and that brings in the continuities as well, which I do see as kind of bridging both pre-Islamic Republic and post-Islamic Republic in terms of looking at the marginalization of Khuzestan as well. That's something that has been ongoing across the period. Yes. Did I answer your question? I feel like
I mean, I think at this point that was an open question.
yeah.
Like because I'm you keep talking about resource sovereignty, but like sovereignty requires a subject. You haven't yet filled that subject with a decolonial option since the nation.
Well, I suppose it speaks to Adam's point potentially as well, this notion of Arab oil for the Arabs as well, where there is an explicit move to see this resource nationalism that isn't focused on the nation state as such, and the different kind of world making yeah. So I think it is there, but I need to think more about why Iran, why it's the nation state's model isn't then, why there is a move towards this transnational version of resource nationalism that isn't fixated on the nation state. Yeah, so I'd love to get anybody's insights who know more about the Arab world at this time. Yeah.
Feel free to come back in.
Yes, please.
I mean, I think also the book with Nalida,
Yes.
that
Yeah.
you did around the kind of visual and kind of cultural sides. That's where I think it comes out very strongly, actually, this Arab, the different ways these are expressed. What's it called?
Life worlds of Middle Eastern oil.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is an attempt to, it's like an energy humanities edited volume on oil in the Middle East generally.
To just jump in on that discussion, I'm just thinking with your text right now, I obviously don't work on this at all, but the sense that I got was your focus on the everyday and the quotidian struggles of the oil workers, the lowest sort of grade workers, or some of the lowest grade workers, was something that almost circumvented the question of sort of political sovereignty, right? So whilst you have this overtly political discourse coming out of the National Front and Mufaddiq about the nation, or maybe the idea of Iranianization and Iranian oil is kind of ascending at that moment discursively, you have these ordinary people who are making very concrete claims about what kicking out the British looks like, or getting rid of the company looks like. And maybe it's not articulated explicitly in the language of the nation, but it's articulated in a series of demands that I don't think are sort of, I'm not trying to reduce them to sort of economic demands, but an understanding of the political that is about all sorts of things from, housing to, as you said, levels of control within the production of oil. And I mean, this doesn't really sort of answer the question, but I guess one thing that the kind of rich, almost historical ethnographic work that your book does is present their sort of kind of in situ kind of politics, if that makes sense, right? That doesn't necessarily fit into the nationalist framing and category. It's harder to give it a name because it is precisely kind of quotidian in in its demands and in its framings. It's about control rather than the idea of a particular sort of grouping.
Yes.
Should we get some more comments and questions? Maybe one final round? Oh, Lisa.
I mean, I have a sort of super basic question, so I'm going to out myself as very basic here. But yeah, I mean, first of all, thanks so much for coming and presenting this. It's just such an amazing book. It's so expansive and it brings together so many different, really important things. So yeah, it's just brilliant. So I had a kind of basic question about research and archives and methods, because your research stretches to so many different archival sites, and I wondered whether you could say a little bit more about that, and also the relationship between those archival sites and the subject matter. So I'm wondering, on a very basic level, how far did you kind of find what you set out to find, and how far did the archives sort of thrust upon you like particular themes around that you were not necessarily expecting, like around maybe social reproduction and the spatial analysis and everything?
Yep.
Hi, I work in energy consultancy and tend to advise companies and governments nowadays on local content regulations and obligations. I just wondered if you could say a few comments as to how your work relates to modern local content regimes. Obviously, nowadays the local content obligations are quite detailed, requiring quotas of indigenous workers at different levels of organizations. Sometimes that's negotiable or biddable, and it's still a point of conflict sometimes, obviously, between energy companies and post-government.
Daniel, and then pass it back.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the chapter on Abadan as a city and like how you analyze the sort of spatial organization and then that sort of contributed to the social reproduction. And like especially the idea of this sort of super capitalist social reproduction that still managed to find its sort of blossom despite like this very specific organization. I was wondering if you could expand on that more.
I was supposed to ask a question about maybe more in relation to the environmental aspects of oil. So obviously, with the kind of Western episteme understanding of resource extraction and that kind of, you know, oil as a resource to be harnessed, and that's kind of the whole foundation of that model of knowledge. I was wondering if you ever came across different relationships to oil and the surrounding environment in your research.
I think that's
Yeah.
a great set of comments and questions.
Thank you, Lauren. It's really nice to see you again, Daniel. So yeah, the environmental aspect, what I see, I mean, certainly there's a different relationship to oil existing already in Khuzestan in terms of you don't necessarily have this separation of the environment and humans, like this Cartesian dualism, human nature, that actually the oil was being used because it seeped to the ground. So it was used in everyday life, for example, as for illumination as torch, or used as an adhesive for making boats, for example. You don't have that distance, that kind of distance between humans and nature that happens in seeing something as a natural resource. But to assume something as a natural resource, you're already assuming this distance and this separation where the environment is kind of detached from humans, and humans often being emptied out of those environments to turn it into a resource. And what happens is in the 1940s, there are these debates circulating in the Tehran press about oil because it's something new to them. They don't really know much about oil. They're debating it and they're kind of reporting on incidences of oil seepages in different parts of the country, saying what should be done? You know, maybe we can just use this oil that's seeping to the surface. But what ends up happening is that this view of oil as a distant natural resource, it's something that takes over in the national discourse. Yes, the environmental aspect, the environmental history angle of this book is something that was relatively late, and it's kind of marginal there. I kind of use it in the framing, but if I were to write this book now, given environmental history is in my job title, I might have focused a bit more on environmental transformations. There was a brilliant dissertation by a student of mine last year on the role of animals in building the oil operations in Khuzestan. It came through in the toxicity. That's how I became interested in environmental history. I didn't start out looking at oil for the environmental history angle. I started looking at it through the lens of labor because it was the center of Iran's working class. And it was only, and this is something that brings me to Lisa's question, it's something that came up in the archive. It was by looking at these labor disputes between workers and management, these complaints about toxic gases and exposure to them, that I started reading all this literature on environmental history, histories of pollution, toxicity, but also the STS stuff on disputes over, this is where the regimes of imperceptibility comes in. It's all through that. So it kind of led me down this path. In terms of the archives, the main archive is the BP archive. It was like my second home during in Warwick, University of Warwick. It's very unique as an archive for oil companies. Most oil companies, their archives are closed, or their archives are kind of like not official company archives, but are kind of collections of donated material, usually relating to PR, not necessarily internal documents. So I was in a unique position, and many others have done this as well, the social history of oil in Iran, is you can really kind of reconstruct everyday life in these rich reports of living conditions on the ground using that archive. But at the same time, there are obviously still going to be silences in that corporate archive, especially, you know, in terms of certain grievances around, like, pollution and toxicity was often made invisible in the BP's archive. And so I had to look to other archives and oral history. So that's why the archives in Tehran, the parliamentary archives, were useful for these issues to do with environment, toxicity and pollution. And the oral history is also, obviously in the corporate archive, there's only so much granularity you can go into. You can't really get that qualitative account so easily. So that's where the oral histories become necessary to kind of fill those gaps, and maybe also some of the petitions sent to the Iranian parliament as well. And then the visual archive, which is where I'm heading now. In many ways, I'm becoming more interested in the visual and audio-visual archive of oil, and thinking about how infrastructure is visualized and made visible, because often we think of it as invisible. Thinking about how actually oil companies really try to make it visible to support its claims as well. So yeah, that's and I think it's through the visual archive that I was able to understand more the strategies of making this effect of the technological zone, because often it's not so clear it's obviously not explicitly articulated, but when you see it visually, you can see like these issues of black boxing and making workers invisible. Yes, local content obligations. I must admit, I'm not the person to ask about this. I think Adam would know more than me in terms of the contemporary oil industry. But yeah, I don't, Adam, do you? No. All I know is that there's still, in terms of these issues of disentanglement, that we actually hosted Hanieh Appel here a couple of years ago now, whose book, The Licit Life of Capitalism, about offshore oil in Equatorial Guinea, I think does a really good job of talking about these tensions between meeting local obligations on the one hand, and also still trying to disentangle from national commitments. So I'd really recommend that in understanding the contemporary oil industry. But what I was trying to do also, because that book and her articles that she wrote on offshore rigs, they really influenced me a lot. And also Andrew Barry's work on material politics. And I wanted to know, is there a longer history to these forms of disentanglement in the oil industry? And this kind of offshore, before the offshore was actually a reality, in a sense. So that's what I guess I was also trying to do by situating this in the story of Abadan and what happens when you create a city that is dependent on this oil refinery, and kind of all the mistakes of Fordism in that sense, and producing your own gravediggers. Yeah. Time.
Perfect timing. So join me in thanking Mattin for a fantastic presentation. Having our final seminar for the year in 2 weeks' time. We will be reading Nasser Abdulrahman's wonderful book, The Time Beneath the Concrete. So we look forward to seeing you then.